What's up, U.S. history? Okay, here we go. Conspiracy theory day. We've been covering the Kennedy assassination really kind of this past week, and that's probably more time than I would normally spend on a political assassination or the murder of one person because the Kennedy assassination is it's a huge cultural event that definitely shocks America. I think it was one of those once in a lifetime moments, but it felt like the world just stopped. If you hear people that were old enough to remember it when it happened, whether they were in school or an adult. Usually most people can remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard the news that President Kennedy had been shot. Now, I don't want to spend a ton of time on conspiracy theories because well, they're theories. They're not conspiracy facts, right? And most of these, I don't really think hold water. Now, granted, that's a subjective thing because, to this day, the last time they did polling data, and it was around the 50th anniversary, about 10 years ago of the Kennedy assassination. So in 2013, they had done a lot of polling, and that was when the movie Parkland came out. And at that point, still a strong majority of Americans believed that the Kennedy assassination, there was more to the story than what we know, that there was a conspiracy and Oswald did not act alone. Now, I've studied this quite a bit, and I would not say I'm an expert or anything like that, but I have dug into it because, of course, it's something I cover in history, and I'm also fascinated by assassinations and things like this, and just this era, the 1960s in general. So I've dug into it quite a bit. I'll tell you, now this is Taluki's own subjective take on it, that I think Oswald probably was the lone gunman, that he acted alone. And I'll also say the little tidbit I'll add on here. I'm going to go over different conspiracy theories and just kind of give them to you in a nutshell, a really, really brief overview. And if you're interested in them, you can go dig into them on your own and explore them more, because literally there's hundreds of books out there about Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories. So you do what you want with that info and dig into it. Go down that rabbit hole as deep as you want. But there is one out there that actually Mr. Fry introduced me to, which I totally laughed off when he first told me about it. But there is one conspiracy theory that I'm going to do a separate recording to that I find plausible. Now, that one's a little bit different from the rest of them. I'll explain what I mean in that other separate video that I think you should also check out. But here we go. Let's get into some of the big conspiracy theories that are very well known. And I'm definitely not hitting all of them, but I'm going to hit some of the biggies. Let me move my face here. Now, first up, just kind of a precursor to this lesson, what are why conspiracy theories? Why are humans so fascinated by conspiracy theories in general? And I think it kind of boils into gets down to just human nature in general. And I broke it down into 3 points, which the computer's being a little difficult here. Let me move my face. First, we want things to have meaning. I think that's a very deep-rooted part of humanity, that we find randomness very disconcerting, that even if there is some nefarious purpose out there and there are evil powers that are working behind the scenes, at least there's a plan and somebody's in control. The whole idea that just one random nut who had just got a job at the Texas School Book Depository, this one nut job who's kind of unstable, that he could take out the most powerful man in the world, that's kind of disconcerting. It's uncomforting to think that, really the world could be that random. But sometimes things are pretty random and happen without really any meaning or deeper purpose. But we as humans like to find meaning in things. Also, point two, and I think most of you would know this to be true, humans love gossip and stories. We're hardwired to sit around the campfire. Think for hundreds of thousands of years, people have sat around in the evening and told stories to each other. Now, that might be a tradition that's slowly going away in the modern age, but for most of human history, humans did a lot of storytelling, and they'd sit around face to face and talk about stuff. And we like to hear these other human interest stories. That's why I try to, in my history class, often relate things rather than just looking at a big movement or dates and facts and, battles or things like that. I like to try to incorporate actual people's stories into things because I think it makes history come alive more. And it gives you a little taste of maybe some of that gossipy type stuff too that humans seem to thrive on. And then my third point up there is sometimes they're just fun. We like them because they're interesting and weird, and you know what I mean. It just catches our interest, and a lot of these conspiracy theory type stuff. It may be you might find history class or just reading a history textbook kind of dry, but man, when you're learning about some crazy kooky conspiracy theory, it engages you and just kind of sucks you in. Now, let's get down to the meat and potatoes of this presentation. This stuff I've already kind of gone over, but if you have not put it in your notes, like for this one, you really don't need to take a ton of notes on these different conspiracy theories. They're theories, and most of them I think are not legit. So I don't really want you spending a ton of time taking notes on it. It's more we're doing this for fun and because I think it's worth discussion because they are so widespread. But this slide is the one slide on here that you would want to have this information in your notes. So have your Cold War notes out if that was where you put the Kennedy stuff in. And then kind of the last thing we covered, I did give you some notes on the Kennedy assassination. Most of this you should already have in there, but this is the stuff that is the undisputed facts that even the conspiracy theorists can agree on. This stuff would have been kind of hit and covered in the movie Parkland that hopefully all of you have watched by this point. So it happened November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, in Dealey Plaza. That was for sure where it went down. He was starting to campaign for re-election. That was why he was down there in the first place. It was all caught on camera, which was remarkable considering it was 1963 and most people did not have cameras and weren't walking around the streets with those. But Abraham Zapruder did happen to catch this all on camera, and he did a tremendous job actually holding the camera steady. So we have a pretty good view and can like kind of forensically analyze what happened that day. If you didn't have that footage, man, all bets would be off. And then I think conspiracy theories would likely be even more widespread. And then JFK also, like had been president through 3 tumultuous years. There are other presidents that we've covered in this time period in my U.S. history class this year that I haven't spent as much time on. So Kennedy, and there's some of those other guys were presidents for 8 years or longer, and I didn't quite dedicate quite as much time to them. So why do I spend so much time on Kennedy? I mean, I am kind of a Kennedy fan. I think he was overall a good and interesting president, and an interesting guy for that time and that point in American history. But there are other presidents that I think are just as important or maybe had an even bigger impact than Kennedy. But I will say, a lot of times I had said that we judge a president within the context of the times they were president. Would Lincoln be thought of as the greatest American president if he hadn't have been president during the American Civil War? Let's say he had been president 10 years before the Civil War or 10 years after. I don't think we would think of Lincoln the same way. Well, Kennedy just happened to be president through a very tumultuous 3-year chunk of American history where the civil rights movement was blowing up and a lot of epic big things happened within the Cold War. So I think that shapes our understanding and our memory of Kennedy, looking back through American history, that it was a lot of why he is remembered, I think, so fondly, or it's a lot of the stuff that went down while he was president. And then, of course, the assassination, that's icing on the cake for partly how we remember Kennedy today. And he also, many controversial things had happened during his presidency, and he definitely did have some enemies. That's pretty undisputed, too. That there were people out there, and this is probably true of pretty much any American president, that would consider themselves enemies of Kennedy and did not want him to be president. Some of those enemies were foreign, were outside of America, but he definitely had political enemies inside America, too. And there were, for sure, some people that were happy to see him gone. Maybe I shouldn't say they were happy to see him assassinated. That might be kind of a big step or a leap there. But there were definitely people that they didn't think he was doing a good job as president, and they wanted him out of there. So that stuff is all pretty ironclad and legit things that typically even conspiracy theorists or people that are more like me that kind of think Oswald was the guy and he acted alone, we can all kind of agree on this little set of facts that I have there for you. Okay. Different conspiracy theories. Now, there's about 1,000,001 of them out there. Literally, I don't think there's 1,000,000, but there's quite a few out there, and I'm just going to hit a couple of the really big ones. One of the first ones is that the CIA killed Kennedy. The CIA is the Central Intelligence Agency. Think of it as it's kind of like America's like spy organization. The FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, that's like our federal kind of police force that investigates crimes internally in the country. The CIA typically operates more outside of our borders, and they're gathering intelligence and spying on the Soviets and doing things like that. The CIA was the group that had really kind of orchestrated and planned out what would be the Bay of Pigs invasion. You remember me talking about that, where Kennedy, that was one of the first things he dealt with. And it had been planned in the Eisenhower administration that we were going to go try to overthrow Castro. Cuban refugees were going to do the fighting on the ground, and the U.S. Air Force was going to come in and strike Cuban military targets to assist those guys. Kennedy got cold feet on that. It was one of the first things he dealt with. He pulled the plug on it and said, no go. We're not going to do that, because he was worried, and I think this is a justifiable concern, that if we did do missile strikes on a communist country, Cuba, that the Soviets would look at that and say, well, hey, if they're going to go strike little weak communist countries near them, we're going to go, the Soviets, they would go strike other Western democracy targets that are near them. So maybe the Soviets would have then not went and invaded Cuba, but maybe they would have done missile strikes in West Berlin. Maybe they would have invaded West Germany or France or Italy, and that could have provoked a much bigger conflict. So I get where Kennedy was coming with there, but bottom line, when he pulled the plug on this, and then that whole invasion still goes ahead, but without air support, those guys get massacred. It's a horrible slaughter. It doesn't look good, and it makes Castro, the communist dictator, it makes him look more powerful, and kind of, it reaffirms his power within Cuba. Without a doubt, the CIA, a lot of people in our Central Intelligence Agency, this pissed them off, and they were angry, and they were like, hey, the last president, Eisenhower, he greenlit this plan. He was our World War II general and hero. If it was a good enough plan for him, who is this young punk kid basically coming in as president? Now, he wasn't a kid or a punk, but you know what I mean? They were kind of thinking of it that way, that this young, charismatic, good-looking guy with, a great haircut, he's going to come in and squash this whole thing. He made some enemies within the CIA. Now, to say that the CIA assassinated Kennedy or is working with Oswald, or that there were other assassins out there that were working for our government to go do this, that's a pretty big claim. That's pretty salacious and outrageous. And the reason I would say I don't really believe in this one, because if you're going to make a claim that big, then the burden of proof should be on the people making the claim. You should have some rock solid evidence. Like, it's pretty undisputable that there were people in the CIA that hated Kennedy and didn't want him as president and didn't have faith in him as a leader. But then to say that they actively tried to go assassinate and did assassinate the American president, you better have some rock solid evidence to support a claim like that. And honestly, I've just never seen anything. I've only seen circumstantial evidence and anecdotal type evidence. I've never seen any like smoking gun or rock solid like evidence that would make me believe that the CIA was involved. So for that reason, I don't think this conspiracy theory really holds water. The next one, the mafia, the mob, right? Well, I had already told you in the Kennedy lecture series that the Kennedy family was very, very wealthy, and they made their fortune back during the days of Prohibition. They were bootleggers. They were breaking the law and smuggling in whiskey and selling it, and they actually had some mafia connections. Now, I don't think JFK was intertwined with the mob real heavily, but his dad, Joe Kennedy, probably did have some shady connections, and he does seem like a kind of a shady figure in American history. Now, was the Kennedy family totally linked with the mob? Was that like their base of support or anything? Not really. But they had friends of friends that did have some mob connections. And when Kennedy was running for president in 1960, it was an epically close election. There were multiple states that if they had gone the other way, Richard Nixon would have been elected president and not JFK. One of those clutch states was the state of Illinois, and Illinois is where Chicago is, and Chicago is one of the most notoriously corrupt cities in America. That was true back then. I think it's still true today. It's true 100 years ago, back when Al Capone was the main bootlegging guy and running the Chicago outfit there. So longstanding kind of tradition in Chicago of corruption and a strong mafia presence. Well, apparently the story goes that a friend of Kennedy's went to, and he did, I think his name was Peter Lawford. I might be incorrect on that, but I think that's correct. He had connections. He was a singer, and he had connections to the Chicago mob. And he went to some of the mob bosses and said, "Hey, I know JFK. I'm buddies with him, and he's a good dude. And you want the Kennedys to come into power. If JFK's elected, he's going to leave you guys alone. He's cool. He won't mess with you." And he kind of made promises on Kennedy's behalf that Kennedy had nothing to do with. And Kennedy didn't know those promises or reassurances were being made. Well, anyway, those Chicago mobsters, apparently, and some of this is speculation, but that they did some shady things in different precincts in Chicago, and Kennedy won the state of Illinois by literally it was something like a couple hundred votes. In a state of millions of people, that's nothing. That's just the smallest little fraction. And there, it could be the Teamsters, which is a big union that was linked up with the Chicago mob, basically did some shady things in some of those precincts to make sure that basically all the votes went to JFK, even though that might not have legitimately been the case or the way the people of Illinois were voting. At any rate, the state of Illinois does go for Kennedy by the narrowest of margins. Kennedy does become president. Well, then when Kennedy becomes president, he was not aware of any promises like that. He never made any promises that he wouldn't go after the mob. And he appoints his brother, Bobby Kennedy. So a younger Kennedy brother becomes the attorney general, the top lawman in the United States. He's like the head federal prosecutor. He runs the whole Justice Department, which honestly, I didn't get into that, but that was kind of a scandal too, that he appointed his brother to an important role like that. Now, Bobby Kennedy, he's an interesting figure too that we're going to talk a little bit more about down the road, but long story short, Bobby Kennedy goes after the mob. He starts hitting these guys hard, and he puts a lot of big mobsters behind jail. So kind of continuing on this conspiracy theory, it was the mob really feels like there was a bait and switch, like they were cheated, that damn it, they promised us that the Kennedys were going to lay off us, and then the Kennedy brothers get in there and come into power, and they come after us more than any president has in history. So they really feel like they got screwed, and potentially the mob went after Kennedy and hired in some assassins to go take him out. Now, again, same as with the first one, if you're making a claim like this, now definitely the mob is a shady criminal type organization. Would they be above going and taking out a political enemy? Probably not. But would the mob be able to pull something like that off and take out the president of the United States? Well, if you're going to believe that, you better have, again, some rock solid evidence and really have that catch them red-handed or have that smoking gun, metaphorically speaking. And I just have never seen any ironclad evidence that makes me believe that. So for that reason, I kind of say I think this one is just a conspiracy theory too, and not much more than that. However, I will say there were a lot of mobsters that were very angry with the Kennedy brothers and definitely were not happy with how they were running their administration. Next one, the Russians. This one would kind of make sense, right? Because we're at the height of the Cold War. During the Kennedy administration, you had the Bay of Pigs. That was a tense situation where, we try to overthrow Castro, a communist dictator. Then you have the Berlin crisis a year or so later where the Berlin Wall gets built and Kennedy goes and gives his Ich bin ein Berliner speech and, to a crowd of, cheering Germans, and tensions were raised over there in West Germany, which was kind of, in a lot of ways, the focal point of the Cold War. And then you have the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's the closest the world ever comes to an all-out nuclear exchange. We almost go to war with the Russians. Crisis averted, thankfully. But definitely you could say there are people in the Russian government that feel like Kennedy is an erratic figure, that he's unpredictable. They don't like this new guy, that Eisenhower, the old general, that he was more predictable and easy to work with than Kennedy actually was. So definitely there were people within the Soviet Union, and this wouldn't be too shocking, that weren't fans of the American president and didn't like him and might have liked to see him out of power. Now, again, you need to have some really ironclad evidence here. Now, Oswald, the shooter, he did go live in Russia for a few years. But if you look at released KGB documents, which the KGB is kind of like the Russian version of our CIA, uh, they did look at Oswald, and they've even admitted this, that they'd considered using him as some sort of a spy, but they felt like he was so kind of incompetent and such a basket case and so mentally unstable that they ruled it out right away and said, this guy, I mean, the Russians definitely had spies in America, but they thought, this guy, he's no good. We can't really use him. He's just not competent enough. He doesn't have what it takes. So again, with this one, just like the first two, I'd say I've never seen any ironclad evidence that the Soviets were behind it. Now tensions were high, sure, and we were close to a war with them, and it's definitely true that like if one side or the other was going to invade and start a war with the other side, both sides had plans that we probably would activate spies in America and try to take out top American leaders. That's a realistic scenario. If you noticed in the movie Parkland, when they get Kennedy to Parkland Hospital, they have Lyndon Johnson, who's the vice president, they are rushing him inside because they're worried that more gunmen are out there. They're looking with their guns up in the air, waiting for Russian planes to come in. Tensions are high there, and it's a realistic scenario that the Russians might try to do something like this. But again, no real ironclad evidence. And judging by the documents that the Russians have released, it seemed like they were as shocked by this probably as we were and didn't really see it coming. Next up, the Secret Service. Now, those are the guys that are in charge of protecting the president, the dudes in the black suits that are sitting on the car, that are, right? There's Kennedy in the parade, actually, and a Secret Service guy, if you follow my cursor, sitting on the back bumper of the car, riding along, protecting him. The next carload back is loaded with Secret Service guys. Now, this is kind of a weird one because why would the guys that are in charge of protecting the president take him out? Well, this is the one conspiracy theory that I think is actually plausible. It's going to be a little bit more of a lengthy story, but if you're interested in this, the one story out there that Taluki says, I'm not saying it did happen, but it might have happened. I would say watch my next video, and I'm going to break this one down kind of point by point and go through all of the key aspects of it. Anyway, again, for this one, I don't see any 100% ironclad evidence, but this one, more than any of the others, there is something behind it, and some fishy things happen, and there without a doubt was kind of a cover-up that was going on. Now, for this theory, too, it's not as nefarious as the others. It's not, just so you know, to give you kind of in a nutshell, it wasn't that the Secret Service guys purposely went and tried to take out JFK or were working with Oswald. It's more like a big mistake happened and they try to cover their butts because they realize they'll be blamed for the death of the president. That one makes me, just that alone makes it more believable to me, because I think often there's a lot of incompetence everywhere in the world, and people don't like to get caught in their own incompetence. And it makes sense that just it's human nature that if you did make a big mistake like this, that you would try to cover your butt. So this one will get covered in a different video, but this is the one that I give kind of a maybe to. So I'm just hitting a few of them. That's kind of the big ones that I'm most familiar with. But there are so many other ones. Lyndon Johnson, vice president, he and Kennedy were not like super close friends. He actually, JFK had put Lyndon Johnson on as vice president because Kennedy was worried about winning southern states. He was worried that southern Democrats, who were the pro-segregationists and were not in favor of the civil rights movement, that a lot of them were not going to vote for some northern Yankee kind of liberal Democrat. But Lyndon Johnson was a good old Texas boy, and he had a lot of clout and a lot of power down south. So Kennedy had promised him that, hey, you're going to be a new kind of vice president. I'm going to use you, and it's going to be teamwork, and we'll work together, and join my ticket, and we'll win the presidency together. But then when Kennedy actually became president, he didn't include Lyndon Johnson on many things. And Lyndon Johnson had been a very powerful congressman. And then as vice president, he felt like he had become worthless. I've heard it said before, this is a famous old quote, that the vice presidency isn't worth a warm bucket of spit. Meaning that basically the vice president's main job is to kind of do nothing and just sit around and wait for the president to die. Well, in this case, the president does die, and we do know that without a doubt, Lyndon Johnson was probably not going to be on the ticket again for Kennedy's second term. He was really depressed. He was ready to leave. And his ultimate goal, he liked power and he wanted to be president really bad. That's pretty much undeniable. So a lot of people try to get some theory that Lyndon Johnson may have been behind it or involved in it. Again, I don't see any real evidence for that. And that's a pretty rotten thing to say about somebody. And I think Lyndon Johnson, you could say some bad things about this guy who we'll be covering next. He definitely, there are things that I would be critical of him about, but I don't think he was a murderer. Some people thought it was a former lover. Kennedy had quite a few affairs. That's something that didn't get covered in the press back then in the media of the 1960s. But it's thought, hey, maybe it was some lover scorned that did something to try to take him out. Maybe it was the Cuban mob. There's this idea that there was a magic bullet, that the bullet trajectory didn't line up right. Well, I think that's kind of been debunked today. And I have another video, the single bullet theory, which I think is the single bullet fact, that I think kind of debunks that. Maybe there was a second gunman on the grassy knoll. Some people said they heard different shots from different angles, and some people reported seeing another gunman over on this grassy park area. Again, maybe it was aliens, maybe it was Bigfoot, who knows? The list goes on, and we could talk about it for days, and literally there's hundreds of books written about this. So, hey, if this stuff interests you, I recommend go dive down the rabbit hole. There's no shortage of information out there on the internet. Go check some of it out. It's, at the very least, I think it's fun to learn about, even though, in my mind, most of these conspiracy theories don't really hold water. Now, the photo I have right above my head here, this is, if you've never seen it before, this is at Arlington Cemetery, and this is where President Kennedy is buried. And he has an eternal flame, which you can not see real great, but it's there, that burns right at his gravesite. Now, the Washington, D.C. trip did get postponed for a year. If you are interested in going on that, there's still time actually to register because of the way it was postponed for COVID. Anyway, if you go on the DC trip, you will be basically as close as you are in this photo. You'll be able to walk right up to it, and not actually there's a little rope right in front of you, but you will be able to, if you go on the DC trip, we go to Arlington. That's one of the highlights of the whole trip, and you'll be able to visit the Kennedy gravesite where he's buried, and actually his son that died in the 90s is buried there. He had two other children that died in infancy, and then his wife, who lives on past the assassination, after she dies of natural causes, she's also buried there today too, right by the eternal flame. So that's a pretty cool thing to check out. Kind of a somber place to be, but it's a very interesting and fun part of, or I shouldn't say fun, but it's a good highlight part of the DC experience. So hopefully you like this stuff and you had a little fun with the conspiracy theory lesson. That's all I got for you today. If you have any more questions, concerns, comments, anything like that, or just want to chat a little more about it, by all means, shoot me an email and I'll be happy to get back with you as soon as I can.